If you were dropped into early medieval England tomorrow, stripped of modern medicine, modern law, and modern assumptions about comfort, you would not be asking philosophical questions about identity or freedom. You would be asking one question only: how do I stay alive through the next winter? This period is often softened by nostalgia, framed as simpler or more grounded than the modern world, but that view collapses once you strip away the romance. Survival was not a background concern. It was the defining structure of life itself. Every decision revolved around food, weather, disease, authority, and violence. The Dark Ages were not dark because people were ignorant. They were dark because survival demanded constant negotiation with forces no individual could control. If you want to understand this period honestly, you have to stop thinking like a modern observer and start thinking like someone whose life expectancy depends on a good harvest and a healthy gut. That is exactly what we are going to do here. Understanding your place in the social order determined your odds of survival. Roughly 85% of England's population lived as serfs or dependent peasants. This mattered because status determined everything from diet to legal protection. As a serf, you were not a slave, but you were bound to land owned by someone else. You could not legally leave without permission, and your labour obligations were fixed regardless of weather, illness or family crisis. Survival depended on compliance. A practical strategy was invisibility. Avoid conflict, meet obligations exactly, and never attract attention from authority. Those who survived longest were not the strongest or bravest, but the least noticeable. Daily labour was not optional, and pacing your body was essential. Agricultural work ran from dawn to dusk, season after season. Ploughing, sowing, harvesting, hedging and tending animals were done with simple tools that punished joints and muscles. Injury could be fatal, not because the wound itself was severe, but because rest was rarely possible. One practical survival tactic was task specialization within families. Older children handled lighter work, women balanced domestic labor with fieldwork, and men reserved peak strength for the most demanding tasks. This informal labor management reduced exhaustion and injury, increasing household survival chances. Well, food scarcity, you see, shaped behavior more than belief or culture ever could. The diet back then consisted primarily of coarse bread, pottage, and whatever vegetables could be grown close to home. Meat was a rare treat, and often legally restricted. Survival, my friend, depended on preserving every calorie. Drying peas, storing grain carefully, and stretching meals with water or broth were standard practices. A critical tactic, you might say, was hedging against famine by planting multiple crops rather than relying on a single grain. Communities that diversified their food sources, well, they survived crop failures better than those who did not. Hunger wasn't just an occasional visitor. It was, quite frankly, expected. Water management, let me tell you, was a life-or-death skill. Contaminated water it killed silently. Rivers and wells were often polluted by waste and animal runoff. Experienced households, when they could, boiled water or mixed it with weak ale, which reduced bacterial risk through fermentation. This wasn't about cultural preference. It was all about disease prevention. Dysentery and cholera, they spread fastest in settlements that ignored water discipline. Survival meant understanding the thirst. Well, it could kill faster than hunger. Housing design, you know, was crude but functional for survival. Homes were small, smoky, and often shared with animals. This wasn't ignorance. It was insulation. Animals produced heat, which reduced winter mortality. Of course, the trade-off was disease. Successful households, they cleaned bedding frequently, controlled vermin aggressively, and ventilated smoke as much as possible. Respiratory illness, it killed slowly but predictably. People who adapted their dwellings, well, they survived longer than those who endured conditions passively. Disease was, well, a constant companion, and prevention mattered more than treatment. Medical knowledge was limited, but, patterns were observed. Communities recognized that overcrowding increased illness and that certain foods could actually make sickness worse. Isolation of the sick, though it wasn't perfect, did reduce outbreaks. Herbal remedies were used not because they truly cured disease, but because some could reduce symptoms just enough to let people recover. Survival in those days relied on careful observation, not superstition. Women faced specific survival threats that honestly shaped family strategy in profound ways. Childbirth was really one of the leading causes of female death. Families would delay pregnancies when possible and relied on experienced midwives. Women had to balance their labour carefully during pregnancy to avoid complications. Survival often depended on social networks among women rather than on male protection. These informal systems were absolutely critical, and I'd say still underestimated by modern observers. Law and punishment were designed, first and foremost, to control, not to protect. Justice prioritized order, not fairness. Trial by ordeal was not symbolic. It was a literal risk. Avoiding legal trouble was, in itself, a survival strategy. Most people internalized law as a set of dangers, not as rights. Those who understood when to submit and when to disappear, well, they lived longer. Warfare disrupted survival even when battles were distant. Conscription took labourers from the fields and destabilized food production. Families prepared by storing surplus when possible and relying on extended kin networks. Viking raids destroyed not just people but infrastructure, triggering famine months later. Survival meant, really, preparing for consequences long after the violence had ended. Surviving England's Dark Ages required adaptability, discipline, and social awareness more than strength or courage. People survived not because life was easier, but because, frankly, they learned how to endure without alternatives. If you strip away modern assumptions, the question is no longer whether life was harder, but whether we could function under such constraints at all. If this breakdown helped you understand the realities behind the myths, subscribe to The Past They Hid. Share this video with someone who thinks history was simple, and stay with us as we keep uncovering what the past actually demanded.